The concrete bench was cold against my back, and the evening shadows stretched long across the empty platform. 67 years old, and here I sat, abandoned like a piece of forgotten luggage. The last train had departed 20 minutes ago, its red tail lights disappearing into the darkness, taking with it my only chance of getting home tonight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Stephanie Long, though most people call me Steph, and I never imagined I'd find myself in this position, stranded at Millbrook Station with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart full of disbelief. The man who'd promised to drive me home, who'd sat at my dinner table just hours earlier calling me mom, had vanished into the night, leaving me here like I was nothing more than an inconvenience he could simply discard. But David Richardson, my daughter Sarah's husband, had no idea who he'd just crossed. He saw an elderly woman in modest clothes, someone he could manipulate and abandon without consequence. What he didn't see was the weight of decisions I'd carried for decades, the sacrifices I'd made, and the fortune I'd built while living in the shadows of simplicity. Tonight would be the beginning of his education, though he wouldn't realize it for quite some time. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, the bitter taste of betrayal that I'd grown too familiar with over the years. I pulled my thin cardigan tighter around my shoulders and looked up at the star-studded sky, wondering how a simple family dinner had led to this moment of abandonment. The evening had started pleasantly enough. Sarah had invited me for Sunday dinner, something we'd been doing monthly since her father passed 3 years ago. I'd taken the train from downtown just as I always did, carrying a small bouquet of daisies from my garden and a homemade apple pie that filled my kitchen with cinnamon warmth all morning. Sarah met me at the door with her usual embrace, though I noticed immediately how thin she'd become. Her cheekbones were more prominent than they should be for a 34-year-old woman, and there were circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Still, she smiled that radiant smile that had lit up my world since the day she was born, and for a moment, I forgot my concerns. "Mom, you look wonderful," she said, taking the pie from my hands with reverence. Sarah had always loved my baking, even as a child when she'd stand on a kitchen stool, flour in her hair, helping me measure ingredients with tiny, careful hands. David appeared in the hallway behind her, his presence filling the space in a way that always made me slightly uncomfortable. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, and his voice carried that particular tone men use when they're performing kindness rather than feeling it. "Stephanie, good to see you again," he said, though his eyes were already scanning past me as if checking to ensure I hadn't brought anything more substantial than flowers and pie. "How was the train ride?" "Peaceful, thank you." I handed Sarah the daisies and followed them into their modest 2-bedroom apartment. The furniture was nice enough, though I noticed several pieces that had been expensive when they'd bought them 2 years ago were missing. The leather recliner David had been so proud of was gone, replaced by a second-hand chair that didn't match anything else in the room. Dinner conversation flowed awkwardly, punctuated by David's increasingly pointed comments about finances. He complained about the cost of everything: groceries, utilities, Sarah's part-time job at the local library not bringing in enough money. Sarah grew quieter with each complaint, pushing food around her plate rather than eating. "It's just temporary," Sarah said when David mentioned they might need to move somewhere cheaper. "Once I finish my certification program, I'll be able to work full-time again." David's laugh held no humor. "That program's costing us money we don't have, Sarah. Maybe it's time to be realistic about our situation." I watched my daughter's face crumble slightly, saw her dreams being dismissed with casual cruelty, and felt something harden in my chest. Sarah had always been brilliant, graduating summa cum laude from college before life and marriage convinced her to set aside her ambitions. Now, at 34, she was trying to rebuild her career, and her husband was sabotaging her efforts with financial manipulation. The library certification is a wonderful opportunity, I said gently. Sarah has always had such a gift for helping people find exactly what they need. David's smile was tight. Easy to say when you're not the one paying for it. He gestured around the apartment. Look at this place, Stephanie. We can barely afford rent as it is. What David didn't know was that I'd been quietly helping with their expenses for months, anonymous payments to their electric company when service was threatened, grocery gift cards left in Sarah's mailbox, small checks disguised as birthday gifts. I'd learned to help without being detected, having grown tired of David's pride rejecting assistance while his selfishness endangered my daughter's well-being. After dinner, Sarah disappeared into the kitchen to make coffee, leaving me alone with David. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with calculating eyes. You know, Stephanie, Sarah worries about you living alone in that little apartment, he said, his tone deceptively casual. Have you given any thought to what you'll do when you get older? I mean really older. I kept my expression neutral, though my instincts immediately sharpened. I manage quite well, thank you for now. Sure, but what happens when you can't? Social Security doesn't go very far these days. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. I have been talking about the future, about what kind of support system you'll need. The conversation felt rehearsed, practiced. I wondered how many times he'd had this discussion with Sarah, planting seeds of worry about her aging mother's financial security. I appreciate your concern, but I'm quite independent. Independence is a luxury, Stephanie, one that requires resources. His smile was sharp now, predatory. We're all family here. When the time comes, we'll need to make some practical decisions about pooling resources and sharing responsibilities. I understood now. David wasn't concerned about my welfare. He was inventory checking his future assets in his mind. I was already a burden to be managed, a problem to be solved with whatever meager savings an elderly widow might possess. Sarah returned with coffee, her presence immediately lightening David's demeanor. He became the attentive husband again, asking about her day and complimenting the meal she'd prepared. But I'd seen behind the mask now, glimpsed the calculator running behind his eyes. As the evening wound down, I mentioned needing to catch the 9:15 train home. David immediately offered to drive me, despite my protests that I was perfectly capable of taking public transportation. Nonsense, he said, already reaching for his keys. What kind of son-in-law would I be if I let you take the train at night? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sarah hugged me goodbye at the door, holding on just a moment longer than usual. I love you, Mom, she whispered, and something in her voice made my heart ache. The drive to the station started normally enough. David made small talk about the weather, asked polite questions about my week, and played the role of the considerate son-in-law. But as we got closer to Millbrook Station, his demeanor began to shift. You know, Stephanie, I meant what I said earlier about the future, he said, his eyes focused on the road ahead. Sarah's got enough to worry about without adding concerns about your situation to the mix. My situation is quite stable, thank you. Is it though? He pulled into the station parking lot, but instead of driving to the drop-off area, he parked in a dark corner near the freight loading dock. Look, I'm going to be direct here because I think you deserve honesty. The reasonable tone, the false concern, it was all so carefully constructed. I realized this moment had been planned, that the entire evening had led to this conversation in a dark parking lot where no one could witness what happened next. Sarah and I are struggling financially, really struggling, and frankly, having to worry about what's going to happen to you as you get older is adding stress to our marriage. He turned in his seat to face me fully now. I know you probably have some savings tucked away, maybe a small life insurance policy. It would mean a lot to Sarah, to both of us, if you'd consider making some arrangements now while you're still healthy enough to make those decisions. The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a man asking me to sign over my assets to relieve his financial stress, packaging it as concern for his wife's peace of mind. I'd encountered this kind of manipulation before in my business dealings, but never from someone who called me family. I see, I said carefully. And what kind of arrangements did you have in mind? Nothing dramatic. Maybe add Sarah as a beneficiary on your accounts. Give her power of attorney so she can help you manage things as you get older. Hell, if you wanted to make things easier, you could even move in with us. Pool our resources. His smile was practiced, sympathetic. I know it's a big decision, but family takes care of family, right? I looked at this man who had married my daughter, who shared her bed and her dreams, who was systematically destroying her self-confidence while plotting to manipulate her elderly mother out of whatever modest savings she might have. The calculating nature of it, the casual cruelty, made my stomach turn. I'll need to think about it, I said finally. Of course, no pressure, but his smile said otherwise. Why don't you take some time, maybe talk to your financial advisor or whoever handles your affairs? We can discuss it more next time. He got out of the car and walked around to open my door, a gesture of courtesy that felt more like a threat. As I stepped onto the pavement, he handed me my purse, which I hadn't realized he'd been holding. Train should be here in about 10 minutes, he said, checking his watch. You sure you'll be okay? I'll be fine, thank you. Great. Give me a call when you've had time to think things over. Sarah's really hoping we can work something out. He was already backing away, keys jingling in his hand. Take care, Stephanie. I watched him drive away, tail lights disappearing around the corner, and felt the first flutter of unease. The platform was empty, unusually so for a Sunday evening. I walked to the schedule board and felt my heart sink. Sunday service had ended at 8:30. The last train had departed 45 minutes ago. David had known, of course. He'd known. He'd checked the schedule before offering to drive me. He had planned this moment of abandonment as carefully as he'd planned his manipulation attempt. Leave the old woman stranded. Let her spend a night wondering how she'll get home, and maybe she'll be more receptive to his generous offer of family assistance. I stood on that empty platform, purse clutched in my hands, and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete vulnerability. Not because I lacked resources, far from it, but because someone I'd trusted, someone my daughter loved, had deliberately put me in harm's way to advance his own agenda. The station was located in an industrial area surrounded by warehouses and freight yards. No restaurants, no hotels, no taxi stands. My cell phone, I realized with growing alarm, was sitting on my kitchen counter at home. I'd been so focused, forgetting the pie and flowers that I'd walked out without. The night air was growing colder, and my cardigan wasn't nearly warm enough for an extended stay outdoors. I had $17 in my purse, enough for a cup of coffee if I could find an open cafe, but not enough for a hotel room or a taxi ride across the city. For the first time in years, I was truly alone and apparently helpless. David had calculated this moment perfectly, had stripped away my independence and left me to confront my own mortality in the most stark terms possible: an elderly woman abandoned at night with nowhere to go and no one to call. But what David Richardson didn't understand was that I'd been underestimated before. I'd been dismissed, discounted, and written off by men who thought they could see the entirety of my worth in my modest appearance and quiet demeanor. They'd all learned eventually that assumptions about elderly women could be dangerously wrong. I walked to the bench at the center of the platform and sat down, arranging my purse on my lap and taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The first lesson of surviving unexpected challenges was to remain calm, assess available resources, and develop a strategic response. Panic was a luxury I'd never been able to afford. A freight train rumbled past, its whistle echoing across the empty yards, and I found myself thinking about Sarah, my beautiful, brilliant daughter who'd married a man slowly destroying her spirit. She'd called him loving, supportive, understanding when they'd first gotten serious. I'd seen the warning signs even then: the way he isolated her from friends, discouraged her ambitions, made her feel guilty for spending money on herself. Now he was escalating, targeting her mother as his next source of manipulation and control. Tonight's abandonment wasn't just about money, it was about demonstrating power, showing both Sarah and me exactly how expendable he considered us to be. A security guard appeared at the far end of the platform, flashlight in hand, making his rounds. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded me of my nephew. "Evening, ma'am," he said as he approached. "Train service ended about an hour ago. Are you waiting for someone to pick you up?" I could have lied, could have said yes, and hoped he'd move along without asking too many questions. Instead, I found myself telling him the truth. My son-in-law was supposed to drive me home, but he seems to have gotten confused about the train schedule, I said carefully. "I'm afraid I'm a bit stranded until morning." His expression immediately shifted to concern. "Oh no, that's terrible. Do you have someone you can call?" I gestured to my purse. "No phone, I'm afraid. It's at home on the kitchen counter." He pulled out his own phone without hesitation. "Here, use mine. Call someone to come get you." The kindness of strangers was something I'd relied on throughout my life, particularly in the early years when I was building my business and couldn't afford to trust the wrong people. This young man saw an elderly woman in distress and immediately offered help. No questions asked, no ulterior motives. "That's very kind of you," I said, accepting the phone, "but I'm afraid there's no one to call. My daughter lives across town without a car, and I don't want to worry her unnecessarily." He frowned, clearly troubled by my situation. "There's a diner about 6 blocks from here that stays open all night. It's not the nicest part of town, but it's warm and safe. I could walk you over when my shift ends at midnight." 6 blocks in the dark through an industrial area to sit in an all-night diner until morning? Not ideal, but certainly better than spending the night on a train platform. I was about to accept his offer when another voice interrupted us. "Everything all right here?" We turned to see an older woman approaching, maybe 10 years younger than me, wearing a custodial uniform and carrying a large ring of keys. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face held the weathered kindness of someone who'd worked hard her entire life. "This lady got stranded when she missed the last train," the security guard explained. "I was just telling her about Murphy's Diner." The woman looked me over with shrewd, assessing eyes. "Murphy's isn't safe for someone like you at night, honey. Too many drunks and troublemakers." She looked at the guard. "What time does the first train run tomorrow?" 6:15 a.m. She nodded thoughtfully. "I'm Rosa Martinez. I clean the office buildings around here, work the night shift. There's a break room in the Hartwell building with a couch and a coffee maker. It's warm, safe, and I'll be there all night. You're welcome to rest there if you'd like." Another stranger offering kindness. I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen, a reminder that David's cruelty didn't represent the entirety of human nature. "That's incredibly generous," I said. "Are you sure it wouldn't be any trouble?" Rosa smiled, and her whole face transformed. "Honey, I've got 3 daughters and 2 granddaughters. If one of them was stranded somewhere at night, I'd hope someone would look out for them." She gestured toward a cluster of office buildings across the street. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." I stood up, clutching my purse, and looked back at the young security guard. "Thank you for your kindness. The world needs more people like you." He touched the brim of his cap. "Hope you get home safe, ma'am." Rosa led me across the empty street, her keys jingling with each step. The Hartwell building was a modest 3-story structure housing various small businesses, an accounting firm, a dental practice, a real estate office. Rosa used her key to let us into the lobby, which was dimly lit but clean and warm. "Been cleaning these buildings for 12 years, she said as we walked to the elevator. "Never had any trouble, and the security here is good. You'll be safe." The break room was on the 2nd floor, a small space with a kitchenette, a round table, and a well-worn couch that looked remarkably comfortable. Rosa immediately started a pot of coffee and gestured for me to make myself at home. "What's your name, honey?" "Stephanie Long, and I cannot thank you enough for this kindness." "Rosa Martinez, and don't mention it." She settled into the chair across from me, studying my face with frank curiosity. "So, what's the real story?" Because I've been around long enough to know when someone's been abandoned rather than just forgotten. Her directness was refreshing after an evening of David's manipulative politeness. My son-in-law offered to drive me to the station, knowing perfectly well that the last train had already left. I believe he was trying to make a point. Rosa's expression darkened. "What kind of point requires leaving an elderly woman stranded at night?" "The kind that involves money and control," I said quietly. "He's been pressuring me to sign over my assets, making him and my daughter beneficiaries of my accounts. Tonight was supposed to demonstrate how vulnerable I am, how much I need his protection." "Son of a," Rosa said with feeling. "Pardon my language, but that's exactly what he is." "How's your daughter handling all this?" "She doesn't know about tonight yet, and I don't think she realizes how manipulative her husband really is. He's very good at presenting himself as concerned and caring while systematically undermining her confidence." Rosa poured coffee into two mismatched mugs and handed me one. "I've seen this before with my own daughter's first husband. Started small, criticizing her friends, making her feel guilty for spending money on herself, isolating her from family. By the time she realized what was happening, she felt like she couldn't survive without him." "How did she get out?" "Took time and support, but mostly she had to see for herself what he was doing. Nobody could convince her. She had to experience it directly." Rosa sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "What are you going to do about tonight?" "About him?" It was a question I'd been avoiding, partly because the answer was complicated and partly because it involved revealing things about myself that I'd kept hidden for decades. But sitting in this break room with a woman who'd shown me such spontaneous kindness, I found myself wanting to tell the truth. "David thinks I'm a helpless elderly woman with modest savings and no options," I said carefully. "He's made assumptions about my financial situation based on how I dress, where I live, how I present myself to the world." Rosa raised an eyebrow. "And those assumptions are wrong?" "Significantly wrong." I smiled for the first time since leaving Sarah's apartment. "David Richardson has no idea who he just crossed, but he's going to learn. The question is whether I teach him gently or let him discover the truth the hard way." "What's the hard way?" I thought about the phone calls I'd need to make in the morning, the conversations that would need to happen, the careful restructuring of certain financial arrangements that David had unknowingly benefited from for months. The hard way involves him losing everything he thinks he's entitled to while learning exactly how much power this helpless old woman actually possesses. Rosa grinned. "I like the hard way." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and listening to the distant sounds of the city at night. Rosa told me about her daughters, her granddaughters, her plans to retire in a few years and move closer to her family in Arizona. I found myself sharing stories about Sarah's childhood, about my late husband, about the small joys that filled my quiet life. What I didn't share was the complexity of my financial situation, the business empire I'd built from nothing, the careful balance I maintained between public modesty and private wealth. Those were secrets I'd kept for good reasons, and tonight's events had reminded me why that secrecy was necessary. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Rosa suggested I try to get some rest on the couch. She covered me with a spare blanket from her cleaning cart and settled into the chair with a book, keeping watch while I slept. It was an act of protection so natural, so instinctive, that it brought tears to my eyes. I dozed fitfully, waking every hour or so to find Rosa still there, still watching over me like a guardian angel in a custodial uniform. At dawn, she made fresh coffee and offered to drive me to the early train. "I've got my car in the parking garage," she said. "It's not much, but it'll get you to the station safely." As we drove through the empty streets in her well-maintained but aging Honda, I made a decision that would change everything for both of us. "Rosa, what would you say if I told you I wanted to offer you a job?" She glanced over at me curiously. "What kind of job?" "The kind that pays well, offers excellent benefits, and involves working for someone who values loyalty and kindness above everything else." I smiled at her startled expression. I have some business interests that require management, and I need someone I can trust completely, someone who would look out for a stranded stranger because it's the right thing to do. Stephanie, I don't know anything about business. You know about people. You know about character. You know when someone's lying and when they're telling the truth. I reached into my purse and pulled out one of my business cards, not the modest ones I used for casual acquaintances, but the heavy stock ones with the embossed logo of Long Enterprises. Everything else can be learned. Rosa pulled over to the curb and stared at the card. Long Enterprises? You're… Yes, her voice was filled with amazement. The Stephanie Long who owns half the commercial real estate downtown, among other things? Yes. Holy, she whispered, then immediately looked embarrassed. Sorry, You're worth millions. More than that, actually. And tonight, David Richardson tried to manipulate a multimillionaire into signing over her assets because he was too arrogant to look beyond surface appearances. I tucked the card back in my purse. Think about my job offer, Rosa, in the meantime. Can I ask you to keep tonight's conversation confidential? She nodded mutely, still processing the revelation. We reached the train station just as the 6:15 was pulling in. Rosa walked me to the platform, still looking shell-shocked by everything she'd learned. Stephanie, she said as I prepared to board, what are you going to do about your son-in-law? I smiled, feeling a familiar surge of strategic satisfaction. I'm going to give him exactly what he asked for, a demonstration of how family takes care of family. He just won't like the lesson as much as he expected. The train pulled away from Millbrook Station, carrying me home through the morning sunlight as the industrial district gave way to residential neighborhoods. I began planning my next moves. David had made his play, shown his hand completely, revealed the depth of his arrogance and the extent of his cruelty. Now it was my turn. By the time I reached my modest downtown apartment, I had a strategy. It would take time to implement, require careful coordination, and demand absolute precision in its execution. But by the end of it, David Richardson would understand exactly what kind of woman he'd chosen to underestimate. More importantly, my daughter Sarah would finally see her husband's true nature, and she'd have the resources and support she needed to make her own choices about their future. I made a pot of tea, settled into my favorite chair by the window, and reached for my phone. The first call would be to my attorney, the second to my financial advisor, and the third to a private investigator who specialized in delicate family matters. David thought he'd left a helpless old woman stranded at a train station. Instead, he'd just declared war on someone with the resources, intelligence, and motivation to destroy him completely. The only question now was whether he'd learn his lesson quickly enough to salvage anything from the wreckage he was about to create. Somehow, I doubted it. Men like David Richardson rarely possessed the wisdom to recognize their own limitations until it was far too late. The morning light filtered through my apartment windows as I sat at my kitchen table, sipping Earl Grey tea from my grandmother's china cup. The events at the train station felt surreal now, like a bad dream that clung to the edges of consciousness. But the ache in my back from sleeping on Rosa's breakroom couch reminded me that David's cruelty had been all too real. I'd been home for 3 hours, had showered, and changed into fresh clothes, but I couldn't shake the memory of standing on that empty platform, abandoned and vulnerable. Not because I lacked the means to handle the situation, I'd weathered far worse storms in my 73 years, but because someone who claimed to love my daughter had deliberately put me in harm's way. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, and my heart immediately tightened with worry. Mom, thank goodness you're home. I was so worried when David said you'd insisted on taking a taxi instead of letting him drive you to the station. Her voice carried that breathless quality she got when she was genuinely upset. He felt terrible about it, she said. You seemed offended. When he offered to help, the lie was so smooth, so perfectly crafted, that for a moment I was genuinely impressed by David's audacity. He'd not only abandoned me but had somehow twisted the narrative to make himself the wounded party, the caring son-in-law whose generosity had been spurned by a stubborn old woman. "I made it home safely, sweetheart," I said, carefully not trusting myself to say more without revealing the truth about last night. "I know, but David was up half the night worrying. He kept saying he should have insisted on driving you, that he should have ignored your protests." Sarah's voice carried genuine affection for her husband's supposed concern. "He really cares about you, Mom. Sometimes I think he worries about you more than I do." The manipulation was breathtaking in its completeness. David had managed to position himself as the hero of his own cruelty, the devoted son-in-law whose care had been rejected by an ungrateful mother-in-law. And Sarah, trusting and loving as she'd always been, had accepted his version of events without question. "David is very thoughtful," I managed, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "He really is. And Mom, I hope you'll consider what he mentioned last night about the future. I know it's hard to think about getting older, but having some kind of plan would give me such peace of mind." Sarah's voice grew softer, more vulnerable. "I love you so much, and I just want to make sure you're taken care of." There it was, the seed David had planted already taking root in my daughter's mind. He'd used her love for me as a weapon, transforming her natural concern into a tool for his own manipulation. The brilliance of it was sickening. "We can talk about it soon," I said, "but right now I'm more concerned about you. You seemed tired last night, then. Are you taking care of yourself?" "I'm fine, Mom. Just busy with the certification program and work. David's right that it's expensive, but I really think it'll be worth it in the long run." Her voice carried a defensive edge that broke my heart. Even with me, she felt the need to justify her dreams, to argue for her right to better herself. We talked for a few more minutes about inconsequential things: the weather, her job at the library, my garden. But underneath the casual conversation, I could hear the stress in her voice, the careful way she spoke about money and David's concerns. My daughter was walking on eggshells in her own life, and I'd been too focused on maintaining my own privacy to fully recognize the extent of her husband's emotional abuse. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and let the rage build, not the hot, explosive anger that clouds judgment, but the cold, calculating fury that had served me well in business for decades. David Richardson. I had made the mistake of targeting not just me but my child, and for that, he was going to pay a price he couldn't imagine. I opened my laptop and began making notes, creating a detailed timeline of David and Sarah's relationship, their financial struggles, and the subtle signs of manipulation I'd overlooked or dismissed. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd feared. David had isolated Sarah from most of her friends within 6 months of their marriage, always with reasonable excuses. Her college roommate lived too far away to visit regularly, her work friends were too focused on their own problems, and her cousin Emma, who'd been like a sister to her growing up, was deemed too negative and jealous of Sarah's happiness. He discouraged her from pursuing the graduate degree she'd wanted, convincing her they couldn't afford it while he bought expensive gadgets and tools for his various hobbies. When she'd finally decided to pursue the library certification program, he'd made her feel guilty about every dollar it cost and every hour she spent studying instead of focusing on his needs. Most insidiously, he'd gradually convinced her that her family, particularly me, didn't understand their situation, didn't support their marriage, and couldn't be trusted with their private business. I realize now that last night's conversation about my finances hadn't been impulsive, it had been the culmination of months of preparation. Turning Sarah against the idea of confiding in her mother while simultaneously positioning himself as her protector against my supposed interference. The depth of his psychological manipulation was staggering, and now he was escalating, moving from emotional control to financial exploitation, using Sarah's love for me as leverage to gain access to resources he thought I possessed. My first call was to Marcus Chin, my attorney for the past 20 years. Marcus had handled everything from business acquisitions to estate planning, and he understood both my public persona and my private reality. "Stephanie, good morning. How can I help you?" I need to discuss a delicate family matter. Marcus, my son-in-law, attempted to manipulate me into signing over power of attorney and making him a beneficiary of my accounts. When I didn't immediately agree, he abandoned me at a train station with no way home. There was a moment of silence. He did what? I related the previous evening's events in detail, watching Marcus take notes on his tablet. His expression grew progressively darker as I described David's calculated cruelty and the lies he'd told Sarah. Afterward, this is elder abuse, Stephanie. Attempted financial exploitation at minimum, possibly criminal abandonment, depending on the circumstances. Marcus leaned forward. We could file charges. Not yet. I want to handle this carefully, strategically. Criminal charges would devastate Sarah, and she's not ready to see her husband for what he really is. I sipped my tea, organizing my thoughts. What I need is a comprehensive background check on David Richardson, employment history, credit report, financial records, criminal background, if any exists. I want to know everything about this man who married my daughter. Done. What else? I need you to research Sarah's legal options regarding divorce, property division, and spousal support. I want to know exactly what her rights are and what resources she'd have available if she decides to leave him. I paused, choosing my words carefully. And I need you to prepare documents that would allow me to support her financially without David having any claim to those resources. Marcus nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. If he's this manipulative about your assets, he'll certainly try to control any support you provide to Sarah. We can structure things to protect her completely. One more thing. I want to establish a scholarship fund for women pursuing continuing education, specifically library sciences and related fields. Modest at first, maybe $50,000 annually, administered through the city library system. Any particular reason for the library focus? Sarah is passionate about library work, but David has made her feel guilty about the cost of her certification program. If she happened to receive a scholarship based purely on merit, it might give her the confidence to pursue her dreams regardless of her husband's objections. Marcus smiled. Purely coincidental that your daughter would be eligible for such a scholarship? Purely coincidental. I agreed. After hanging up with Marcus, I called Elena Rodriguez, the private investigator I'd used for business matters. Elena was thorough, discreet, and had an uncanny ability to uncover information that people thought they'd buried. Elena, I need a complete background investigation on David Richardson, married to Sarah Long Richardson. I want to know everything: finances, employment, relationships, habits, weaknesses, and I need it done without him or my daughter knowing about it. Personal or business matter, family protection. He's manipulating my daughter and attempted to financially exploit me. I need ammunition. How detailed do you want me to go? I want to know what he had for breakfast 3 months ago. This man threatened my family. Elena, I need leverage. After scheduling the background investigation, I made one more call, this one to Janet Morrison at First National Bank. Janet had been managing my personal accounts for 15 years and understood the complexities of maintaining privacy while managing substantial wealth. Janet, I need to restructure some of my charitable giving and establish some new anonymous funding mechanisms. What did you have in mind? I want to create an emergency fund for women leaving abusive relationships. Start with $200,000, managed completely anonymously through the Women's Shelter downtown. They should have discretionary access to provide housing, legal assistance, job training, whatever these women need. That's very generous, Stephanie. I have a feeling I might know someone who could benefit from such resources in the near future. I paused, thinking about Sarah's situation. I also want to establish a fund to pay utility bills for struggling families, anonymous payments to prevent service disconnections, help with deposits, that sort of thing. What I didn't tell Janet was that David and Sarah had been receiving anonymous assistance with their electric bill for months. If David wanted to play games with family finances, he was about to discover just how dependent he'd become on the generosity of the woman he'd tried to manipulate. The rest of the morning was spent reviewing my various business interests and investment portfolios. Long Enterprises owned commercial real estate throughout the city, had significant holdings in technology companies, and maintained diverse investment accounts that generated substantial monthly income. On paper, I was worth considerably more than the millions Rosa had mentioned at the train station, but wealth, I'd learned over the decades, was only as powerful as the secrecy that protected it. The moment people knew what you had, they began making plans for how to take it from you. David's attempt to manipulate me was just the latest in a long series of similar efforts throughout my life. I'd started building my financial empire in my 30s after my husband died and left me with a small life insurance policy and a mountain of medical debt. While raising Sarah as a single mother, I'd worked during the day as a bookkeeper and spent my evenings learning about real estate investment, stock analysis, and business development. Every spare dollar went into carefully researched investments. Every opportunity was evaluated for its long-term potential. By the time Sarah graduated from high school, I'd paid off the medical debt and accumulated enough assets to pay for her college education without loans. By the time she graduated from college, I'd built a portfolio worth several $1,000,000, and by the time she married David, I'd become one of the wealthiest individuals in the city, though almost no one knew it. I maintained my modest apartment, shopped at discount stores, drove a reliable but unremarkable car, and lived well below my means in every visible way. The only people who knew the truth were my attorney, my financial advisor, my accountant, and a handful of business associates who'd signed comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. This secrecy had served me well over the years, protecting me from gold diggers, scam artists, and family members who might have had their own plans for my money. But it had also created an unexpected vulnerability, people like David who saw an elderly woman living modestly and assumed she was financially powerless. My phone rang again, interrupting my financial review. "Mrs. Long, this is Rosa Martinez from last night." "Rosa, of course. How are you?" "Still processing everything, to be honest. But I wanted to call and tell you I'm interested in that job offer if it was serious." It was completely serious. "When would you like to start?" "Well, I need to give 2 weeks' notice at my current job, but I could meet with you this week to discuss details if you'd like." I smiled, feeling genuinely pleased for the first time since the previous evening. "Would tomorrow afternoon work? Say 2 o'clock at my apartment." "Perfect. And Mrs. Long, I've been thinking about what you said about your son-in-law. If you need any help with anything, any kind of surveillance or information gathering, I know people who could assist." "What kind of people?" "My ex-husband was a private investigator before he retired. He still has contacts in the business and knows how to find information quietly. My daughter, Maria, works in city administration. She has access to public records, permit applications, that sort of thing." The offer was generous and completely unexpected. Rosa had known me for one night, had learned about my wealth only hours ago, and was already offering to help me deal with David's manipulation. It was exactly the kind of loyalty and character I valued most. "That's very thoughtful, Rosa. Let me think about it, and we can discuss it tomorrow." After hanging up, I realized I had a decision to make about how to handle David's escalation. I could take the high road, attempt to reason with him, and try to help him understand that his behavior was damaging his marriage and threatening his relationship with Sarah. Or I could play the game by his rules, using the same calculated manipulation he'd employed against me. The problem with taking the high road was that it required David to possess qualities he'd already demonstrated he lacked: empathy, self-awareness, and genuine concern for others' well-being. Men like David Richardson didn't respond to reason or appeals to their better nature. They responded to power, leverage, and consequences. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "David wants to take you to lunch this weekend to apologize for last night. He feels terrible about the miscommunication." Would Saturday work? The audacity was remarkable. David wanted another opportunity to manipulate me, probably hoping that a public setting would make me more receptive to his financial proposals. He'd spin last night's abandonment as a misunderstanding, present himself as the caring son-in-law eager to make amends, and then renew his pressure for me to sign over power of attorney. I texted back, "Saturday sounds lovely. Tell David I'm looking forward to our conversation." If David Richardson wanted to play games, I was more than happy to accommodate him. But he was about to discover that he'd chosen the wrong opponent and the stakes were much higher than he imagined. I spent the afternoon making additional phone calls, setting up meetings, and putting pieces in place for a strategy that would unfold over the coming weeks. By evening, I had a comprehensive plan that would accomplish several objectives simultaneously: protect Sarah from further manipulation, expose David's true character, and ensure that my daughter had the resources and support she needed to make informed decisions about her future. The plan required patience, precision, and perfect timing. Most importantly, it required David to continue behaving exactly as he had been: arrogant, manipulative, and convinced of his own superiority. Given what I'd observed of his character, I was confident he wouldn't disappoint me. That night, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine and my grandmother's photo on the side table. She'd been a wise woman, my grandmother, who taught me that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies was to give them exactly what they thought they wanted, and then let them discover the true cost of their greed. "Well, Grandma," I said quietly, raising my glass to her photograph, "looks like it's time for another education in consequences." The next morning brought a call from Elena Rodriguez with preliminary information about David Richardson. What she'd found in just 24 hours was illuminating and deeply troubling. "David has a pattern, Stephanie. This isn't the first time he's targeted vulnerable women for financial gain." Elena's voice was grim. Before Sarah, he was engaged to a widow named Patricia Chun. She was 62 and had inherited a modest estate from her late husband. The engagement ended abruptly after she discovered David had been stealing from her accounts. Did she press charges? No, she was too embarrassed, felt stupid for trusting him, and didn't want her family to know how badly she'd been deceived. She moved out of state shortly after and gave me her contact information in case anyone else needed to know about David's behavior. What else? He's got significant debt, credit cards, personal loans, a car payment that's 3 months behind. His job at the marketing firm is solid but not well-paying, and his spending habits are completely unsustainable. He's looking at potential bankruptcy within 6 months unless he finds a new source of income. The pieces were falling into place. David's pressure on me wasn't just about greed, it was about desperation. He was drowning financially and saw Sarah's family as his lifeline. The widow Patricia had been his previous attempt at financial salvation, and when that fell through, he targeted my daughter. "There's more," Elena continued. "I found evidence that he's been intercepting Sarah's mail, redirecting some of her financial documents to a post office box he controls. He's also been monitoring her email and social media accounts. He's surveilling his own wife, complete digital stalking. He has access to everything: her bank accounts, her school records, her communication with friends and family. Sarah has no privacy in her own life." The violation was staggering. Sarah thought she was in a loving marriage, but she was actually living under constant surveillance by a man who saw her as an asset to be controlled rather than a partner to be cherished. "Elena, I need you to document everything: screenshots, financial records, evidence of the mail interception, and digital monitoring. But do it carefully. I don't want David to know he's being investigated." "Already on it. I should have a complete dossier by Friday." "Perfect. And Elena, see if you can locate Patricia Chun. I'd like to speak with her." After Elena hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling sick to my stomach. My daughter wasn't just married to a manipulative man. She was trapped in a relationship with someone who had systematically stripped away her autonomy, privacy, and independence. And she had no idea how completely she'd been compromised. The lunch with David on Saturday suddenly took on new significance. It wouldn't just be an opportunity to counter his manipulation, it would be my chance to begin the process of exposing him completely. But I had to be careful. Men like David became dangerous when cornered, and Sarah's safety had to be my primary concern. Rosa arrived at my apartment promptly at 2 o'clock, dressed professionally and carrying a small notebook. I'd prepared a formal job offer for her, complete with salary, benefits, and a detailed description of her responsibilities as my personal assistant and property manager. The position involves managing my various business interests, coordinating with attorneys and financial advisors, handling correspondence, and occasionally dealing with delicate personal matters, I explained as we sat at my dining room table. The salary is $80,000 annually, plus full health insurance, for weeks paid vacation, and a substantial retirement contribution. Rosa stared at the job offer, her eyes widening as she read the details. Stephanie, this is incredibly generous. Are you sure you need someone with my qualifications for this kind of work? Rosa, you've already demonstrated the most important qualification, absolute integrity. Everything else can be taught. I leaned back in my chair. But I need to be completely honest with you about what this job might involve. My family situation is complicated, and I may need your help dealing with some difficult people. You mean your son-in-law? Among others. Over the years, I've encountered numerous individuals who've tried to take advantage of what they perceived as my vulnerability. Most of them assumed that an elderly woman living modestly must be financially powerless. They were wrong, and they learned that mistake can be expensive. Rosa nodded thoughtfully. What do you need me to do? For now, just learn the business and get comfortable with your new responsibilities. But soon, I may need you to help me protect my daughter from a man who's been systematically destroying her life while positioning himself to steal everything I've worked to build. When do I start? Monday, if you're ready. Rosa extended her hand, and we shook on it. I'm ready. After Rosa left, I spent the evening reviewing the preliminary information Elena had provided about David's financial situation. The details painted a picture of a man living completely beyond his means, maintaining a facade of success while drowning in debt. His car, his clothes, his expenses. I've hobbies. All of it was financed through credit cards and personal loans he couldn't afford to repay. More troubling was the evidence of his systematic control over Sarah's life. He'd gradually isolated her from support systems, monitored her communications, and created a situation where she had to account for every dollar she spent while he made purchases without consultation. The psychological profile was textbook financial abuse, and I'd been too focused on maintaining my own privacy to recognize what was happening to my daughter. Saturday's lunch was going to be interesting. David expected to meet with a vulnerable elderly woman who'd been chastened by her experience at the train station. Instead, he was going to encounter someone who knew exactly what kind of man he was and had the resources to do something about it. I had 5 days to prepare for that conversation, and I intended to use every minute of them wisely. My phone rang again, this time with a number I recognized as Sarah's work extension at the library. Mom, I'm calling from work because I wanted to ask you something privately, she said, her voice unusually quiet. David doesn't think I should bother you with this, but I'm worried about our finances and I don't know who else to talk to. My heart clenched. Despite David's efforts to isolate her, Sarah was still reaching out, still trusting her mother's judgment. What's wrong, sweetheart? We got another notice about the electric bill being overdue, but David swears he paid it. And yesterday I tried to use my debit card at the grocery store, and it was declined. David says it's just a computer error that he's handling everything but Mom. Her voice broke slightly. I'm scared. We're in real financial trouble, and he won't tell me how bad it is. The anonymous assistance I'd been providing had masked the depth of their financial crisis, allowing David to maintain his facade, while Sarah remained unaware of their true situation. My attempt to help had inadvertently enabled his deception. Sarah, do you have access to your own bank accounts? Can you check your statements online? David handles all of that. He says it's easier if one person manages everything and he's better with numbers than I am. She paused. But Mom, I used to be good with numbers. I managed my own finances all through college, never had any problems. I don't understand why I can't handle them now. The self-doubt in her voice was heartbreaking. David had convinced my intelligent, capable daughter that she was incompetent to manage her own financial affairs, creating dependency while positioning himself as indispensable. Sarah, I want you to go to your bank this afternoon and ask for statements on all your accounts. You have every right to access your own financial information. David won't like that. He says when I try to get involved in finances, I just create confusion and problems. David doesn't get to control your access to your own money, sweetheart. You're a grown woman with every right to understand your financial situation. I know. It's just things have been tense between us lately, and I don't want to make it worse. Sarah's voice carried the exhaustion of someone walking on eggshells in her own life. Maybe I should wait and talk to him about it first. But Sarah Elizabeth Long, I said firmly, using her full name the way I had when she was a child who needed to pay attention, you do not need anyone's permission to access your own bank accounts. Go to the bank today, get your statements, and don't tell David about it until you've had a chance to review them yourself. There was a long pause. You're right. I know you're right. When did I become this person, Mom? When did I start needing permission to manage my own life? You didn't become anyone different, sweetheart. Someone convinced you that you had changed, but you're still the same strong, intelligent woman you've always been. You just need to remember that. After we hung up, I felt a surge of hope mixed with renewed fury. Sarah was beginning to question David's control, starting to recognize that his protection was actually imprisonment. But she was also vulnerable, isolated, and financially dependent on a man who saw her as property rather than a partner. The lunch on Saturday couldn't come soon enough. David Richardson was about to discover that his attempt to manipulate a helpless elderly woman had awakened something far more dangerous than he could have imagined: a mother protecting her child. Friday morning arrived with Elena's complete dossier on David Richardson, delivered to my apartment in a sealed envelope that contained enough damning evidence to destroy his life 10 times over. I spread the documents across my dining room table like pieces of a puzzle, each revelation more disturbing than the last. The financial records painted a picture of systematic fraud and manipulation spanning several years. David had stolen over $30,000 from Patricia Chin through a combination of forged checks, unauthorized credit card charges, and elaborate lies about emergency expenses. When Patricia discovered the theft, David had convinced her that pursuing legal action would only publicize her humiliation and destroy her reputation in their small community. More recently, the evidence showed David had been systematically draining Sarah's accounts through a network of deceptions. He'd opened credit cards in her name without her knowledge, taken cash advances against her student loan refunds, and redirected several of her work paychecks to accounts she didn't know existed. My daughter was unknowingly funding her own financial destruction while her husband presented himself as their family's financial protector. The surveillance evidence was equally chilling. David had installed tracking software on Sarah's phone and computer, monitored her email accounts, and even placed a GPS tracker in her car. He knew every website she visited, every person she contacted, and every place she went when she wasn't with him. The level of control was suffocating, turning their marriage into a prison. Sarah didn't even realize she was trapped within. But perhaps most revealing was the psychological profile Elena had compiled based on interviews with David's former colleagues and acquaintances. The picture that emerged was of a narcissist with sociopathic tendencies, someone capable of mimicking genuine emotion while feeling nothing but contempt for the people he manipulated. Several former coworkers described incidents where David had stolen credit for their work, spread malicious rumors about competitors, or betrayed confidences for personal gain. One particularly damning account came from Rebecca Walsh, a former colleague who'd been briefly involved with David before he met Sarah. According to Rebecca, David had spent months cultivating their relationship while secretly copying sensitive client information from her computer. When Rebecca discovered the theft and confronted him, David responded by filing a false sexual harassment complaint against her with their Human Resources Department. Rebecca had been forced to resign to avoid a prolonged investigation, while David had used the stolen information to secure a promotion. The pattern was unmistakable. David Richardson was a predator who targeted vulnerable women, systematically destroyed their financial security and emotional well-being, then moved on to his next victim when they were no longer useful to him. My daughter was simply his latest target. I closed the dossier and sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of decades settling on my shoulders. I'd built my fortune by being cautious, thorough, and strategic in every decision, but I'd failed to protect the person who mattered most to me because I'd been too focused on maintaining my own privacy to recognize the threat living in my daughter's home. Rosa arrived at 9 o'clock sharp for her first official day of work, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of professional attire that suggested she'd taken this opportunity very seriously. I handed her Elena's report without preamble. "Read this," I said simply. "Everything." Rosa settled into the chair across from my desk and began reviewing the documents. I watched her expression change as she absorbed the evidence of David's systematic cruelty. I saw her hands tighten on the papers as she read about his financial theft and surveillance of Sarah. "This is monstrous," she said finally, looking up at me with anger burning in her eyes. "Your daughter is married to a sociopath who's been planning to manipulate me into funding his lifestyle while he destroys Sarah's life piece by piece." I leaned forward. "Rosa, I need you to understand something. What we're dealing with here isn't just greed or marital problems. David Richardson is dangerous. He's demonstrated a willingness to destroy anyone who threatens his plans, and he's shown particular skill at manipulating systems and people to avoid consequences for his actions. What do you want to do about it?" "I want to give him exactly what he's asked for, access to my family's finances, but not in the way he expects." I smiled grimly. "David thinks he's been manipulating a helpless elderly woman with modest savings. Tomorrow at lunch, he's going to discover that he's actually been threatening someone with the resources to destroy him completely." Rosa nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to coordinate with Marcus Chen, my attorney, to ensure that Sarah has immediate access to emergency resources if she needs them, safe housing, legal representation, financial support, everything she might need to leave David safely." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I also need you to work with Elena Rodriguez to document David's ongoing criminal activities. If he escalates his behavior when he realizes he's been outmaneuvered, I want to be able to have him arrested immediately." "And what about the lunch tomorrow?" Rosa asked. "Tomorrow, David Richardson is going to get his first lesson in the difference between vulnerability and strategic patience. He spent months positioning himself to exploit what he thought was my weakness. Instead, he's about to discover that he's been playing chess with someone who's been planning moves he can't even imagine." The rest of Friday was spent in careful preparation. Marcus Chen arrived at noon to brief me on the legal protections we'd established for Sarah, including a trust fund that would provide her with financial independence regardless of what happened to her marriage. Elena came by in the afternoon to install recording equipment in my purse, ensuring that tomorrow's conversation with David would be thoroughly documented. Most importantly, I called Patricia Chen, David's previous victim, who'd agreed to speak with me about her experience. Patricia was a retired teacher living in Oregon, soft-spoken but remarkably courageous in her willingness to help expose David's pattern of abuse. "I've regretted not pressing charges every day for the past 3 years," Patricia told me during our phone conversation. "I thought I was protecting myself from embarrassment, but I was really just enabling him to find new victims. If there's anything I can do to help your daughter avoid what I went through, please let me know. Would you be willing to speak with Sarah directly to help her understand what kind of man she's married to?" "Absolutely. And Mrs. Long, I want you to know that your daughter isn't weak or stupid for falling into David's trap. He's extraordinarily skilled at manipulation, and he targets women who are trusting and loving because those qualities make them easier to exploit. Sarah's goodness isn't a flaw, it's what David saw as an opportunity. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp autumn day that demanded careful decision-making and precise execution. I dressed conservatively but elegantly, choosing clothes that suggested modest means while maintaining dignity. To David's eyes, I needed to look like exactly what? He expected an elderly woman of limited resources who could be pressured into making desperate financial decisions. The restaurant David had chosen was predictably upscale, expensive enough to demonstrate his supposed sophistication, but not so exclusive as to seem inappropriate for a family reconciliation lunch. I arrived 15 minutes early and requested a corner table where our conversation would be private but not completely isolated. David entered the restaurant at exactly noon, his movements confident and purposeful. He dressed carefully as well, choosing clothes that projected success and reliability. The performance was beginning before he'd even reached the table. "Stephanie, you look wonderful," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek with practiced warmth. "I can't tell you how glad I am that we could arrange this lunch. I've been feeling terrible about the miscommunication the other night." I smiled graciously, playing my expected role as the forgiving elder. "These things happen, David. The important thing is that we're here now." He settled into his chair and immediately launched into his prepared speech about family responsibility and mutual support. The words were carefully chosen, designed to sound caring while establishing the framework for his financial demands. He spoke of his love for Sarah, his concern for my well-being, and his desire to create a unified family approach to planning for the future. "The truth is, Stephanie, Sarah and I have been struggling financially," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of vulnerable honesty. "I know I mentioned this the other night, but I think you deserve to understand the full scope of our situation." "I appreciate your candor," I replied, though what I actually appreciated was the opportunity to watch a master manipulator at work. We've fallen behind on several bills, and Sarah's certification program is costing more than we anticipated. I've been trying to shield her from the worst of our financial stress, but it's becoming impossible to manage alone. He paused for effect, allowing concern to cloud his features. "The other night, when I brought up the possibility of family financial planning, I wasn't just thinking about your future needs. I was hoping you might be able to help us weather this difficult period." And there it was, the transition from concern for my welfare to requests for my assistance. David was revealing his true agenda while maintaining the pretense of family solidarity. "What kind of help did you have in mind?" I asked. "Well, if you were willing to pool some of your resources with ours, we could create a more stable financial foundation for everyone. Maybe you could help us catch up on our overdue bills, and in return, we'd make sure you're completely taken care of as you get older." His smile was warm and reassuring. It would be a true partnership, a way for all of us to support each other. "And what would this partnership look like in practical terms?" David leaned forward, his eyes bright with anticipation. "I was thinking you could transfer your savings to a joint account that Sarah and I would manage on your behalf. That way, you wouldn't have to worry about financial decisions, and we could ensure that your money is invested wisely while also addressing our immediate needs." The audacity was breathtaking. David was proposing that I hand over my life savings to resolve his financial irresponsibility while disguising the theft as family cooperation. He expected me to fund his lifestyle while surrendering control over my own resources. "That's quite a significant proposal," I said carefully. "What kind of amounts are we discussing?" "Well, I know you've been careful with your money over the years. Sarah mentioned that you probably have some savings set aside, maybe $50,000 or $60,000. If you were willing to contribute that to our family finances, it would solve our immediate problems and give us the stability to take care of you properly." I almost laughed at his gross underestimation. David had calculated my net worth based on my modest lifestyle and conservative spending habits, arriving at a figure that represented less than a month's investment income for me. He was planning to steal what he thought was my entire life savings to resolve debts that exceeded his estimates of my wealth. $50,000 is a substantial amount, I said. I'd need to understand exactly how this money would be used. David's confidence was growing now that he believed I was considering his proposal. Of course, complete transparency. We'd use about $30,000 to catch up on our outstanding debts, credit cards, medical bills, that sort of thing. The remaining $20,000 would go towards Sarah's education and our emergency fund. Every word was a lie. Based on Elena's investigation, David's debts exceeded $80,000, and none of the money would go towards Sarah's education or legitimate family expenses. He was planning to steal my supposed life savings to temporarily delay his financial collapse while positioning himself to demand additional resources in the future. And what guarantee would I have that this money would be managed responsibly? Stephanie, I understand your concern, but you'd be dealing with family. Sarah and I have your best interests at heart, and we'd never do anything to jeopardize your financial security. His voice carried just the right note of hurt surprise, as if my question had wounded him. Besides, with Sarah managing the day-to-day finances and me handling the investments, you'd have multiple safeguards in place. The mention of Sarah managing finances was particularly galling. David had systematically excluded my daughter from every financial decision in their marriage, had stolen money from her accounts, and had convinced her that she was incompetent to handle her own affairs. Now he was using her name to legitimize his theft while planning to continue excluding her from actual financial control. I notice you haven't mentioned discussing this arrangement with Sarah, I observed. Well, I wanted to get your thoughts first. See if you were open to the idea. No point in getting Sarah's hopes up if you weren't interested in helping. David's smile faltered slightly, but I know she'd be thrilled to have a way to help take care of you while solving our financial problems. It's exactly the kind of win-win situation that strong families create together. I sipped my water slowly, allowing silence to build tension while I considered my response. David was watching me intently, trying to read my expression, calculate my receptivity to his proposal. He believed he was close to success, that his carefully constructed manipulation was working exactly as planned. David, I appreciate your honesty about your financial situation, and I'm touched by your concern for my future welfare, I said finally. But before I make any decisions about such a significant financial commitment, I'd like to understand your situation more completely. His smile brightened. Of course, anything you want to know. For instance, I'm curious about how you accumulated so much debt despite having steady employment. $30,000 in overdue bills suggests a pattern of overspending or unexpected emergencies. David's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his confident facade. It's been a combination of things, really. Sarah's medical expenses from last year, some unexpected car repairs, higher than anticipated costs for her certification program. You know how quickly expenses can accumulate. Another series of lies. Sarah hadn't had any significant medical expenses, and the certification program costs were exactly what had been advertised. David's debt had accumulated through his gambling addiction, expensive hobbies, and lavish spending on items he couldn't afford while maintaining the illusion of financial success. And you're confident that this one-time infusion of resources would solve your problems permanently? Absolutely. Once we get caught up on our bills, we'll be able to manage our monthly expenses without difficulty. Sarah's certification will lead to better employment opportunities, and I'm expecting a promotion at work within the next few months. His confidence was returning as he spun his elaborate fantasy. This isn't about long-term dependence, Stephanie. It's about helping family through a temporary rough patch. I nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering his proposal. In reality, I was marveling at the complexity of his deception. David had constructed an entire fictional narrative about their financial troubles, complete with fabricated medical expenses and imaginary promotion opportunities. He was asking me to fund his lies while surrendering control over what he thought was my entire financial future. I'm also curious about the legal arrangements you're proposing, I continued. If I were to transfer my savings to a joint account, what protections would I have to ensure my continued access to these funds? Well, obviously you'd be a signator on the account, able to access your money whenever you needed it. But the beauty of this arrangement is that you wouldn't need to worry about day-to-day financial management. Sarah and I would handle all the details while ensuring your needs are always met. The offer of nominal access was meaningless, and we both knew it. Once my money was in an account controlled by David and Sarah, I would be dependent on their goodwill for every financial decision. David was offering me the illusion of control while planning to strip away my actual autonomy completely. And if I became uncomfortable with the arrangement at some point? If I wanted to withdraw my funds and return to independent financial management? David's hesitation was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. This was the question he'd hoped I wouldn't ask, the scenario he hadn't fully prepared for. Of course you'd always have that option, he said carefully, though I hope that once you see how well we're managing things, you'll want to continue the partnership indefinitely. Sarah and I are committed to taking care of you for the rest of your life, Stephanie. This arrangement would just formalize that commitment. The words "for the rest of your life" hung in the air between us with implication. David wasn't proposing a temporary financial arrangement. He was suggesting permanent control over my resources under the guise of elder care. Once he had access to my money, he'd ensure that I never regained independent control by systematically destroying my confidence and convincing Sarah that I was too confused or incapacitated to manage my own affairs. This is quite a lot to consider, I said, reaching for my purse. Perhaps I should review my financial situation more carefully before making such a significant decision. David leaned forward eagerly. Of course, take all the time you need. But Stephanie, I hope you'll remember that family is the most important thing we have. Sarah loves you deeply, and she'd be devastated if financial problems prevented us from taking proper care of you as you get older. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. David was suggesting that my refusal to fund his debts would somehow endanger my relationship with Sarah, that my daughter's love was contingent on my financial cooperation. He was using Sarah's affection as leverage while simultaneously planning to isolate her from me once he'd gained control over my supposed assets. I stood up slowly, playing the role of the elderly woman who needed time to process complex decisions. Thank you for lunch, David, and thank you for being so honest about your situation. I'll give everything serious consideration. David rose as well, his relief evident. He believed the conversation had gone exactly as planned, that his manipulation had been successful, and I was preparing to surrender my life savings to resolve his financial problems. I'm so glad we could talk openly about this, Stephanie. Sarah is going to be thrilled that we're working together to secure our family's future. I missed my cheek again, the gesture of affection feeling like contamination. Take care of yourself, and let me know when you've made your decision. I walked slowly to my car, maintaining the pretense of being an overwhelmed elderly woman grappling with difficult choices. In reality, I was energized by the completeness of David's self-revelation. He'd exposed his entire strategy, revealed the depths of his greed and manipulation, and demonstrated that he saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. But most importantly, he'd underestimated me so completely that he'd handed me every tool I needed to destroy him. I drove home through the afternoon sunlight, my mind already focused on the next phase of my strategy. David Richardson thought he'd just secured access to $50,000 in elderly widow savings. Instead, he'd just signed his own destruction warrant with someone worth hundreds of millions of dollars who now had every reason to ensure his complete financial and social annihilation. The rest of Saturday was spent in careful coordination with my team. Marcus Chen reviewed the recorded conversation and confirmed that we had sufficient evidence of attempted elder abuse to pursue criminal charges, if necessary. Elena Rodriguez received instructions to begin implementing the consequences phase of our investigation, starting with anonymous tips to appropriate authorities about David's pattern of financial crimes. Most importantly, I called Sarah and arranged to meet with her Sunday afternoon, ostensibly for our regular coffee date, but actually to begin the delicate process of opening her eyes to her husband's true nature. Sunday arrived, gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I prepared for what would likely be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I was about to shatter my daughter's illusions about the man she'd married, destroy her sense of safety and trust, and force her to confront the reality that she'd been living with a predator for years. But I was also about to offer her freedom, resources, and the support she'd need to rebuild her life on her own terms. Sometimes love required causing short-term pain to prevent long-term destruction. Sarah met me at our usual cafe, looking tired and stressed, her beautiful face marked by the strain of living with constant financial uncertainty and emotional manipulation. She hugged me tightly, holding on longer than usual, and I could feel the desperation in her embrace. "Mom, I'm so glad to see you. This week has been..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "David says I worry too much, but I can't shake the feeling that something's really wrong." "What kind of wrong?" I asked. "I went to the bank like you suggested, tried to get statements for our accounts. They told me that 3 of our accounts had been closed last month and the remaining one had a balance of $47. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. When I asked David about it, he said it was just a temporary reorganization, that he'd moved our money to better investment accounts. But Mom, he couldn't show me any paperwork, couldn't give me account numbers, or even tell me which bank our money was supposedly in. My heart broke watching my daughter struggle to maintain faith in a man who'd been systematically stealing from her for years. "What did you do?" I demanded. I wanted to see our tax returns, our credit reports, something that would help me understand our real financial situation. David got angry, said I was being paranoid and disrespectful, that my lack of trust was damaging our marriage. Tears started forming in Sarah's eyes. He stormed out of the house Friday night and didn't come home until this morning. He says he spent the weekend at his brother's house thinking about whether he could stay married to someone who doesn't trust him. The cruel manipulation was breathtaking. David had responded to Sarah's legitimate concerns by threatening to abandon her, making her feel guilty for questioning his lies while simultaneously escalating his emotional abuse. He was using her love and fear of abandonment as weapons against her natural instincts for self-preservation. "Sarah, I need to tell you some things that are going to be very difficult to hear," I said gently. "About David, about your finances, and about what's really been happening in your marriage." "What do you mean?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder containing carefully selected portions of Elena's investigation. Not everything. Sarah wasn't ready to learn about the surveillance or the extent of David's criminal activities, but enough to help her understand that her instincts about their financial situation were absolutely correct. "Your husband has been stealing from you, sweetheart, for months, possibly years. He's taken money from your accounts, opened credit cards in your name, and created debts that you don't even know about." I handed her the financial documents. "This shows a pattern of unauthorized transactions, forged signatures, and financial manipulation that constitutes serious criminal activity." Sarah stared at the papers, her face growing pale as she absorbed the evidence of David's betrayal. "I don't understand. Why would he do this? We're married. If he needed money, he could have just asked me. Because this isn't about need, it's about control. David isn't stealing from you because he's desperate. He's stealing from you because he sees you as property rather than a partner." I reached across the table and took her hands. "Sarah, your husband is what's called a financial abuser. He's systematically destroyed your economic independence while convincing you that you're the problem. But he loves me. I know he loves me. Sweetheart, love doesn't involve theft, surveillance, isolation, or emotional manipulation. What David feels for you isn't love, it's ownership." I squeezed her hands gently. "And what he's been doing to you isn't marriage, it's imprisonment." Sarah pulled her hands free and stood up abruptly, pacing to the cafe window. I could see her struggling to reconcile the Evidence of her emotional investment in her marriage was fighting against the reality that would force her to acknowledge how completely she'd been betrayed. Even if this is true, even if David has been taking money, that doesn't mean our marriage is over, she said finally, her voice desperate. People make mistakes, especially when they're under financial pressure. We can get counseling and work through this together. Sarah, this isn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This is a calculated pattern of criminal behavior spanning years. David hasn't been stealing from you because he's confused or overwhelmed. He's been stealing from you because that was always his plan. I joined her at the window, looking out at the gray afternoon while choosing my words carefully. Yesterday, David and I had lunch together. He asked me to transfer my life savings to a joint account that he and you would manage. He told me this was necessary to help your family through financial difficulties and ensure that I'd be taken care of as I get older. Sarah turned to face me, confusion clouding her features. He never mentioned meeting with you, and we never discussed anything about managing your finances. Of course you didn't, because David's plan was to steal my money the same way he's been stealing yours. He was going to convince me to sign over my assets, then use your name to legitimize the theft while ensuring you never had actual access to those funds. That's impossible. David wouldn't. Sweetheart, your husband thinks I'm a helpless elderly woman with modest savings who can be manipulated into funding his lifestyle. He has no idea that I'm actually quite wealthy, and he certainly doesn't realize that I've been anonymously helping with your bills for months to prevent your utilities from being disconnected. Sarah stared at me in shock. You've been helping us financially? The electric company, the phone bill, even some of your grocery expenses. I've been making anonymous payments to keep your household functioning while David spent your money on gambling and expensive toys. I reached for her hands again. Sarah, the financial crisis he described to me yesterday is real, but it's entirely of his own making. His solution wasn't to address his spending problems or find legitimate ways to increase your income. It was to steal from his wife's elderly mother. The full scope of David's betrayal was finally sinking in. I could see the moment when Sarah's love and loyalty collided with undeniable evidence of manipulation. Her need to believe in her marriage crumbled against the reality of her husband's criminal behavior. What am I supposed to do now? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. How am I supposed to go home to him knowing all this? How am I supposed to pretend everything is normal? You don't pretend anything, sweetheart. You take control of your life, and you protect yourself from further harm. I guided her back to our table, keeping my voice calm and supportive. I've already spoken with my attorney about your situation. You have legal options, financial resources, and a support system that David can't touch or manipulate. What kind of resources? The kind that will ensure you never have to tolerate financial abuse again. The kind that will give you complete independence and the freedom to rebuild your life exactly as you choose. I smiled at her through my own tears. Sarah, I've spent decades building something substantial, something that will ensure my family's security for generations. And you're my family, sweetheart. David Richardson is just a temporary obstacle. For the first time since I'd started revealing the truth about her marriage, Sarah's expression shifted from despair to hope. Mom, what exactly are you telling me? I'm telling you that your mother isn't the helpless elderly woman David thinks he's been manipulating. I'm telling you that you have resources and options he never imagined. And I'm telling you that if David Richardson wants to play games with family finances, he's about to discover exactly how dangerous that game can be when you're dealing with someone who actually owns the board. Sarah's eyes widened as the implications of my words settled over her. She gripped the edge of our cafe table, knuckles white against the dark wood, processing the revelation that her supposedly vulnerable mother possessed resources far beyond David's calculations. Mom, when you say substantial, what exactly do we mean here? I glanced around the cafe, ensuring our conversation remained private. Long Enterprises owns 43 commercial properties in the city alone, plus significant holdings in technology stocks, municipal bonds, and international investments. My net worth is somewhere north of $200 million, though the exact figure fluctuates with market conditions. Sarah's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, clattering against the saucer. 200 million? But Mom, you live in that tiny apartment. You shop at discount stores. You take the bus everywhere. Because privacy and security require careful choices about how I present myself to the world. The moment people know what you're worth, they start making plans for your money. I reached across the table, studying her shaking hands. David spent months studying what he thought was my financial vulnerability, calculating how to exploit an elderly widow's modest resources. Instead, he's been plotting against someone with enough wealth to buy and sell his entire life 10 times over. The color drained from Sarah's face as she absorbed the full scope of her husband's miscalculation. He has no idea, does he, about any of this? None whatsoever. In his mind, he's been maneuvering to steal perhaps $50,000 from a helpless old woman. The reality is that he's declared war on someone who could destroy his entire existence without breaking a sweat. I leaned back in my chair, watching my daughter process this seismic shift in understanding. The question now is what we do with that advantage. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, staring. Looking out the cafe window at the afternoon rain, she finally spoke. Her voice carried a hardness I'd never heard before. I want him to pay for what he's done, not just to me but to you, to Patricia Chen, to everyone he's hurt. She turned back to me, and I saw steel in her expression that reminded me of my younger self. But I also want to be smart about it. I want to make sure he can never do this to anyone else. Pride swelled in my chest. Despite years of David's manipulation designed to undermine her confidence and independence, my daughter's core strength remained intact. She was choosing justice over revenge, strategy over emotion. Then we need to be very careful about timing and execution. David is dangerous when cornered, and we can't risk him escalating his behavior in ways that could hurt you. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Rosa's contact information. I'm going to introduce you to someone who's going to help us coordinate your safety and independence. Rosa arrived at the cafe within 20 minutes, her calm professionalism immediately putting Sarah at ease. I watched my daughter's surprise as I explained Rosa's role in my business operations, another small revelation that her mother's life was far more complex than she'd understood. Sarah, your mother has briefed me on your situation, and I want you to know that you have options, Rosa said, settling into the chair beside us. We've already established emergency protocols to ensure your safety, regardless of what happens with David. What kind of protocols? Safe housing in a secure location that David can't access or trace, legal representation from the city's best divorce attorney, financial resources that will give you complete independence. Rosa consulted her tablet. We've also prepared restraining orders that can be filed immediately if David shows any signs of violence or harassment. Sarah looked between Rosa and me, still struggling to process the rapid transformation of her circumstances. This morning, I was a financially dependent woman trapped in an abusive marriage. Now you're telling me I have resources to completely rebuild my life. Sweetheart, you were never financially dependent. You were being systematically robbed by someone who convinced you that poverty was your fault. I reached for her hands again. The resources were always there. You just didn't know about them because I'd kept my wealth private for security reasons. And now David Richardson has forced my hand by threatening my family. When someone targets my daughter, privacy becomes secondary to protection. I smiled grimly. He wanted access to family money. He's about to discover exactly what that really means. Rosa excused herself to take a phone call, leaving Sarah and me alone to discuss the practical aspects of her situation. The immediate question was how to handle her return home to David, who would be expecting normal behavior while she processed the devastating truth about their marriage. I don't know how to face him, Sarah admitted. How do I look at him knowing what he's done, what he was planning to do to you? How do I pretend nothing has changed? You don't pretend anything. You go home, pack whatever you need, and you leave tonight. I kept my voice gentle but firm. Sarah, there's no healing from what David has done. This isn't marriage counseling territory. This is criminal behavior that will only escalate. But where will I go? What will I tell him? You'll go to a safe location that Rosa has arranged. As for what you tell David, that's entirely up to you. You can leave a letter explaining your knowledge of his crimes, or you can simply disappear. The choice is yours. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, and I watched her expression tighten as she read it. David, he's asking where I am. Says he has exciting news to share about our financial future. She looked up at me with bitter understanding. He's going to tell me about your supposed agreement to help us, isn't he? Almost certainly. He thinks yesterday's lunch was successful, that he's convinced me to transfer my life savings to resolve your family's financial crisis. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. He has no idea that he's about to walk into a trap 2 decades in the making. Rosa returned from her call with updates on our preparations. The safe house was ready, Sarah's legal team was on standby, and Elena had finished documenting David's most recent financial crimes for potential prosecution. There's something else, Rosa said, lowering her voice. Elena discovered that David has been planning to take out a substantial life insurance policy on Sarah. The application was filed last week, naming him as the sole beneficiary. The words hit me like physical blows. David wasn't just planning to steal from Sarah, he was positioning himself to profit from her death. The life insurance application suggested a level of calculated evil that went beyond financial abuse into potentially lethal territory. Sarah's face went white. Life insurance? But I never signed anything, never agreed to any policy. The signature appears to be forged based on handwriting samples from your other documents. Elena believes David was planning to finalize the policy and then create circumstances that would make the death benefit payable. Rosa's voice was carefully controlled, but I could see the anger burning in her eyes. What kind of circumstances? Accidents, suicide, medical emergencies. There are numerous ways to kill someone while making it appear natural or self-inflicted. I reached for my daughter, pulling her into my arms as she began to shake. But none of that is going to happen because David Richardson's ability to hurt anyone is about to end permanently. The revelation of the life insurance application changed everything. This was no longer about financial manipulation or emotional abuse. David was apparently planning murder. The man my daughter had married, who had shared her bed and her dreams, was calculating how to kill her. I'm scared, Sarah whispered against my shoulder. If he's capable of this, if he's been planning to kill me, what's he going to do when he realizes his plans have been discovered? He's going to learn that targeting my family was the last mistake he'll ever make. I pulled back to look at her directly. Sarah, I need you to understand something. The resources I've built over the past decades weren't just for security or comfort, they were for protection. And now those resources are focused entirely on ensuring that David Richardson never threatens anyone again. Rosa coordinated our departure from the cafe with military precision. Sarah would return home briefly to collect essential items while Rosa and Elena monitored the situation remotely. If David showed any signs of suspicion or violence, intervention would be immediate. What about you, Mom? If David realizes you've been helping me, won't he try to hurt you too? Let him try, I said quietly. David Richardson thinks he's been manipulating a helpless elderly woman. Tomorrow he's going to discover exactly what happens when you threaten someone who owns half the city. We parted ways in the cafe parking lot, Sarah heading home to what might be her final conversation with her husband, while I returned to my apartment to coordinate the endgame of David's destruction. Rosa followed Sarah at a distance, maintaining surveillance while remaining invisible. Back in my apartment, I settled at my desk with a cup of tea and began making the phone calls that would reshape David Richardson's entire existence. The first was to Marcus Chin, my attorney, with instructions to accelerate every legal action we'd prepared. Marcus, I need you to file for emergency protection orders, initiate criminal charges based on Elena's evidence, and contact the district attorney about the attempted murder plot. David Richardson stops being a threat to my family today. What about the financial aspects? Do you want to move forward with asset seizure? All of it, freeze his accounts, seize his assets, file liens against any property he might claim. I want him to wake up tomorrow financially destroyed and facing serious criminal charges. I paused, considering the scope of what I was unleashing. And Marcus, contact Patricia Chun. If she's willing to testify about David's previous crimes, we can establish a pattern that will ensure he never sees the outside of a prison cell. The second call was to Janet Morrison at the bank, with instructions to trace and recover every dollar David had stolen from Sarah's accounts. Money that had been flowing through various financial instruments for months, disguised as legitimate transactions, but actually representing systematic theft. Janet, I need you to reverse every unauthorized transaction David Richardson has made against my daughter's accounts. Every forged check, every fraudulent credit card charge, every penny he's stolen, and I want it done immediately. Stephanie, that could involve hundreds of transactions across multiple institutions. The paperwork alone will be handled by my legal team. What I need from you is the financial muscle to make it happen quickly. Sarah Richardson is going to wake up tomorrow with full access to every dollar that belongs to her, plus interest and penalties charged to her husband's accounts. The third call was to Elena Rodriguez, with instructions to coordinate with law enforcement on David's immediate arrest. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes were serious, and the threat to Sarah's life made delayed action unacceptable. Elena, I need David Richardson in custody tonight. Whatever it takes, wherever you need to take the evidence, make it happen. He doesn't get another opportunity to hurt my daughter. Already on it. I've been working with Detective Maria Santos at the Financial Crimes Unit. She's reviewed our evidence and is preparing arrest warrants as we speak. Elena's voice carried grim satisfaction. David Richardson's criminal career ends today. As evening fell, I received updates from Rosa about Sarah's situation at home. David had indeed shared his supposed success in manipulating me into financial cooperation, describing our lunch conversation as a breakthrough in family relations that would solve all their problems. He actually told Sarah that I'd agreed to transfer $50,000 to help them get back on their feet. Rosa reported he's spinning it as my idea, claiming I insisted on helping because I was so touched by his honesty about their financial struggles. The lies were remarkable in their audacity. David had transformed his attempted theft into magnanimous family cooperation, positioning himself as the grateful son-in-law graciously accepting assistance from a generous mother-in-law. Even facing the end of his criminal career, he couldn't resist manipulating the narrative to serve his own ego. How is Sarah handling it? Better than expected. She's playing along, acting grateful and relieved while secretly packing essential items. Elena estimates another hour before she can safely leave without arousing suspicion. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. He's talking about taking a celebration trip once your money comes through. Says we deserve a vacation after all the stress we've been under. I feel sick listening to him. I texted back, hold on just a little longer, sweetheart. This nightmare ends tonight. At 8:30, Rosa called with confirmation that Sarah had safely reached the secure location we'd arranged. She was staying in a luxury apartment in a building I owned, protected by security personnel who understood the gravity of her situation. She's safe. She's got everything she needs, and David has no idea where she is, Rosa reported. He thinks she went to the grocery store and should be back any minute. At 9:15, Elena called with news that would have made me smile if the circumstances hadn't been so serious. David's been arrested. Detective Santos and her team picked him up at his apartment when he called to report Sarah. He became suspicious when she didn't return from the store and started making frantic phone calls. Elena's voice carried dark amusement. The irony is that his own call to the police led to his arrest on multiple felony charges. What's he being charged with? Financial elder abuse, attempted fraud, identity theft, forgery, and attempted murder based on the life insurance application. Detective Santos says it's one of the most comprehensive financial crime cases she's ever seen. Elena paused. There's more. During the arrest, they found surveillance equipment in David's apartment: cameras, recording devices, GPS trackers. He's been monitoring Sarah's every move for months. The surveillance discovery was the final piece of evidence confirming David's complete lack of regard for my daughter's humanity. He'd turned their marriage into a prison, their home into a surveillance station, and their relationship into a predator-prey dynamic that could have ended with Sarah's murder. Where is he now? City jail, being held without bail due to flight risk and the severity of the charges. His assets are being frozen, his accounts are being seized, and every transaction he's made in the past 3 years is being investigated. Elena's satisfaction was audible. David Richardson's life, as he knew it, ended the moment those handcuffs clicked shut. I sat in my quiet apartment processing the rapid transformation of David's circumstances. This morning, he'd been a confident manipulator planning to steal $50,000 from an elderly widow while positioning himself to murder his wife for insurance money. Tonight, he was facing decades in prison while watching his entire financial world collapse. But more importantly, Sarah was safe. My daughter was free from a man who'd systematically destroyed her confidence, stolen her money, and planned her death. She was sleeping in a secure location with access to resources that would allow her to rebuild her life exactly as she chose. My phone rang at 10:30 with a call from Marcus Chun providing updates on the legal aspects of David's situation. The district attorney is extremely interested in this case, particularly given the pattern of behavior Elena documented. They're treating it as organized criminal activity rather than isolated incidents. Marcus sounded pleased. David Richardson is looking at 20 to 30 years in prison if convicted on all charges. What about Patricia Chen? Is she willing to testify? More than willing. She's flying in tomorrow to meet with prosecutors and provide testimony about David's previous crimes. Her evidence will establish the pattern of behavior that makes this a serial predator case rather than a one-time offense. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that Patricia would finally get justice for what David had done to her. More importantly, her testimony would ensure that David could never target another vulnerable woman. And Sarah's financial situation was fully restored. As of an hour ago, every dollar David stole has been recovered and returned to her accounts, plus substantial penalties charged to his frozen assets. She's actually in better financial shape now than she was before she married him. Marcus paused. There's something else. The life insurance company has provided evidence that David had taken out similar policies on Patricia Chen and 2 other women he'd been involved with. This wasn't his first attempt at murder for profit. The revelation that David had targeted multiple women for murder was both horrifying and vindicating. My decision to destroy him completely had potentially saved numerous lives and prevented countless future victims from suffering Sarah's fate or worse. Tuesday morning brought news that David's employer had terminated him after learning about his arrest, that his landlord was beginning eviction proceedings, and that several of his creditors were pursuing collection actions against his seized assets. The financial empire he'd built through theft and manipulation was collapsing with remarkable speed. More importantly, Sarah called to tell me she'd spoken with Patricia Chen, who'd provided invaluable perspective on David's methods in the recovery process. Mom, Patricia told me something that really helped. She said that David's greatest weapon was making his victims feel stupid for trusting him, making them believe they should have known better. Sarah's voice was stronger than it had been in months, but she explained that trusting people we love isn't stupid, it's human. And David's ability to exploit that trust doesn't reflect poorly on us. Patricia is absolutely right. Your capacity for love and trust isn't a weakness, sweetheart. It's one of your greatest strengths. I'm also meeting with a therapist this afternoon, someone who specializes in recovery from financial abuse. Patricia recommended her highly. Sarah paused. Mom, I want to go back to school full-time, pursuing the graduate degree I always wanted. I know it'll be expensive, but money is no longer a concern for you, sweetheart. Not now, not ever. I felt tears of relief and pride. You pursue whatever dreams make you happy, your education, your career, your entire future. It's all possible now. Wednesday brought the news I'd been waiting for, David's first court appearance, where he'd learned the full scope of the charges against him and the extent of his legal jeopardy. According to Marcus, David had requested a public defender after discovering that his assets were frozen and he couldn't afford private representation. He looked shocked when the prosecutor read the charges. Marcus reported, "I don't think he fully understood how much evidence we'd gathered until he heard it presented in court." The attempted murder charge particularly seemed to surprise him. Did he enter a plea? Not guilty on all counts, which was expected, but his attorney immediately requested a meeting with prosecutors to discuss potential plea arrangements. I think reality is starting to set in. An unexpected visitor at my apartment, Detective Maria Santos, arrived with questions about my role in uncovering David's crimes and my willingness to testify at his trial. "Mrs. Long, I have to say that your investigation into Mr. Richardson's activities was remarkably thorough. The evidence you provided has made our job significantly easier." Detective Santos was a compact woman with intelligent eyes and a direct manner that I immediately appreciated. "But I'm curious about your motivation for such an extensive investigation." "David Richardson threatened my family, Detective. When someone targets my daughter, I respond with everything at my disposal." I gestured to the comfortable chair across from my sofa. "Would you like some tea?" She settled into the chair, studying me with professional interest. "Mr. Richardson claims that you've orchestrated an elaborate frame-up designed to destroy him because you disapproved of his marriage to your daughter. He insists that all the evidence against him has been fabricated or misrepresented." I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Detective, David Richardson attempted to manipulate me into transferring what he thought was my life savings to resolve his financial problems. When I didn't immediately agree, he abandoned me at a train station at night with no way home. Everything that's happened to him since then has been the consequence of his own criminal behavior. He also claims that you're not actually wealthy, that the financial resources you've used against him somehow prove that his allegations of fraud are correct." Detective Santos accepted the tea I offered. "Obviously, that's nonsense, but I'm curious about how he's justifying his position." David Richardson spent months calculating how to exploit what he believed was my financial vulnerability. He never considered the possibility that an elderly woman living modestly might actually possess substantial resources. I sipped my tea thoughtfully. His inability to accurately assess his target doesn't transform his attempted crimes into legitimate activities. Fair enough. And you're willing to testify about his attempted manipulation. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to ensure that David Richardson never has the opportunity to harm another woman. If that requires testifying, providing evidence, or using my resources to assist in his prosecution, consider it done. Detective Santos left with my commitment to full cooperation in David's prosecution. More importantly, she confirmed that the case against him was so strong that conviction was virtually certain, regardless of whatever lies he might tell to justify his behavior. Friday morning brought the call I'd been anticipating. Marcus Chun reported that David's attorney had contacted prosecutors about a potential plea agreement that would spare him the most serious charges in exchange for a guilty plea and cooperation in recovering stolen assets. They're offering to plead guilty to financial fraud and elder abuse in exchange for dropping the attempted murder charges. David would serve 8 to 12 years instead of 20 to 30. Marcus sounded skeptical. "The prosecutor wants to know your opinion." "No deal," I said immediately. David Richardson planned to murder my daughter for insurance money. He deserves every year of the sentence those charges carry, and future victims deserve to know that attempted murder has serious consequences. "I thought you'd say that." The prosecutor agrees, actually. She thinks the evidence for attempted murder is solid and wants to set a precedent for similar cases. That afternoon, I drove to the secure apartment where Sarah was staying, bringing Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine to celebrate the beginning of her new life. I found my daughter transformed, still processing the trauma of her marriage's end, but radiating a strength and confidence I hadn't seen in years. "Mom, I've been thinking about what happens next, about how I want to rebuild my life," Sarah said as we shared dinner. "I want to finish my graduate degree, but I also want to help other women who've been through what I experienced." "What do you have in mind?" "A foundation, maybe, or a nonprofit organization that provides resources for women leaving abusive relationships. Not just financial support, but legal assistance, counseling, job training, safe housing, everything they need to rebuild completely." Sarah's eyes brightened with purpose. "I've been reading about financial abuse, and it's much more common than people realize. There are thousands of women trapped in relationships like mine, convinced they're financially helpless when they're actually being systematically robbed." Pride swelled in my chest as I listened to my daughter transform her painful experience into a mission to help others. This was the Sarah I'd raised, the brilliant and compassionate woman who'd been hidden beneath years of David's manipulation. "A foundation is an excellent idea, and you'd have access to whatever resources you need to make it successful." I reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "What would you call it?" "The Patricia Chun Foundation," Sarah said without hesitation. She told me that helping expose David's crimes was the first time in 3 years that she felt like she'd regained some control over what happened to her. "I want to honor that courage and give other women the same opportunity for justice." Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after David's arrest, I sat in my apartment reviewing the complete transformation of our family's circumstances. David was facing decades in prison, his financial world was in ruins, and his ability to harm anyone was permanently ended. Sarah was safe, financially independent, and planning a future dedicated to helping other abuse survivors. More importantly, the secrets I'd maintained for decades about my wealth and resources had served their ultimate purpose, protecting my family when protection was needed most. David Richardson had made the fatal mistake of assuming that modest appearances indicated limited capabilities. Instead, he declared war on someone with the resources to destroy him completely. My phone rang with a call from Elena Rodriguez, providing final updates on David's situation. "David's been moved to state prison pending trial. His attempts to contact Sarah have been blocked, his assets remain frozen, and his former associates are distancing themselves rapidly." Elena's voice carried satisfaction, but there's something else. 3 more women have come forward with similar stories about David's financial manipulation. The prosecutor is considering additional charges. 3 more victims, women he dated before Patricia Chun, all following the same pattern: financial theft, emotional manipulation, and in one case, suspicious circumstances around a car accident that could have been fatal. Elena paused. David Richardson was apparently a serial predator with a very specific methodology. The revelation that David had victimized even more women than we'd known was both horrifying and validating. My decision to use every resource at my disposal to destroy him had potentially prevented numerous future crimes and given justice to victims who'd never thought they'd see their abuser held accountable. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the week's events and the lessons they'd taught me about wealth, power, and responsibility. For decades, I'd used my resources primarily for protection and privacy, maintaining a low profile while building financial security. But David's threat to Sarah had forced me to weaponize those resources in ways I'd never imagined. The result had been the complete destruction of a dangerous predator and the liberation of his victims. More importantly, it had demonstrated to my daughter that she possessed strength and resources beyond anything David had tried to convince her she lacked. Monday morning brought news that David had fired his public defender and was attempting to represent himself in court, apparently convinced that his charm and manipulation skills would succeed where legal expertise had failed. The decision was both arrogant and self-destructive, virtually guaranteeing his conviction on all charges. "He's demanding a meeting with you," Marcus reported during our morning call. "Claims he has information about your business activities that could be embarrassing if revealed publicly. It's a transparent attempt at blackmail, but he seems to believe it will give him leverage." I laughed at David's continued inability to understand the situation he was in. What information could a failed manipulator possibly have about my business activities that would concern me? Nothing legitimate, obviously, but desperate people make desperate threats. Do you want me to ignore his requests? Absolutely. David Richardson had his opportunity to interact with me respectfully when he chose to manipulate and abandon me instead. Now he can face the consequences of his choices without any assistance from the family he tried to destroy. Tuesday brought the final piece of David's destruction, news that he'd been terminated from his professional license due to ethical violations discovered during the investigation. Even if he somehow avoided prison, he'd never again be able to work in his chosen field. More importantly, Sarah called with updates on her foundation planning and her decision to pursue a law degree specializing in domestic violence advocacy. Mom, I've been meeting with other survivors, and the stories are heartbreaking but also inspiring. These women have incredible strength and resilience, but they need resources and support to escape their situations safely. Sarah's voice carried passion and determination. I want to create a model that other cities can replicate, a comprehensive approach that addresses every aspect of financial abuse. You'll have whatever resources you need to make that happen, sweetheart. And Sarah, I'm incredibly proud of the woman you've become through all of this. Your father would be amazed by your strength. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected call from Patricia Chin, now actively involved in supporting David's other victims and planning her testimony for his trial. Stephanie, I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to finally get justice for what David did to me. For 3 years, I felt like a fool for trusting him, like his crimes were somehow my fault. Patricia's voice was strong and clear, but seeing how systematically he's operated, understanding that this was never about my judgment, but about his criminal behavior, has been incredibly healing. You were never a fool for trusting someone you loved, Patricia. David's skill at manipulation doesn't reflect poorly on his victims. I know that now, and I want other women to know it too. Sarah and I are planning to speak at conferences to share our stories and help people understand the warning signs of financial abuse. Patricia paused. We're also working with law enforcement to develop better training for recognizing these crimes. David Richardson is going to prison, but his victims are going to make sure that future predators have a much harder time operating. Thursday evening brought the news I'd been waiting for. David's trial date had been set for 8 weeks from today, and the prosecutor was confident in securing convictions on all charges, including attempted murder. The evidence is overwhelming, the witnesses are credible, and David's decision to represent himself has eliminated any possibility of effective legal defense, Marcus reported. He's going to prison for decades, and every woman he's victimized is going to see justice. Friday morning, I stood on my apartment balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over a city where I owned substantial real estate but lived in modest anonymity. The events of the past 2 weeks had fundamentally changed my relationship with wealth and secrecy, forcing me to use resources I'd accumulated quietly for defensive purposes. But more importantly, they'd remind me that true power lies not in what you own, but in what you're willing to sacrifice to protect the people you love. David Richardson had seen an elderly woman living simply and assumed she was powerless. Instead, he'd encountered someone who'd spent decades building exactly the kind of resources needed to destroy men like him completely. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Foundation paperwork filed today. The Patricia Chin Foundation is officially real. Thank you for everything, Mom. I love you. I smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. David Richardson was facing the consequences of his choices. His victims were getting the justice they deserved, and my daughter was building something beautiful from the ashes of her destroyed marriage. The train station where this all began felt like a lifetime ago, but I could still remember the cold concrete bench and the moment when I realized that someone who called me family was willing to leave me stranded and vulnerable to advance his own agenda. That night, David had made the mistake of assuming that apparent powerlessness indicated actual helplessness. Tomorrow, he would begin learning exactly how expensive that assumption could be. 8 weeks later, I sat in the back row of the courthouse gallery watching David Richardson realize that his life of manipulation and theft was finally over. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on every single charge: elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, forgery, and attempted murder in the first degree. The man who had once abandoned me at a train station, thinking he could manipulate a helpless elderly woman into funding his criminal lifestyle, now stood before a judge wearing orange prison clothing and shackles around his ankles. His confident demeanor had evaporated completely, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone who finally understood the true cost of his arrogance. Judge Catherine Wells reviewed the sentencing guidelines with methodical precision. Mr. Richardson, you have been convicted of systematically targeting vulnerable women for financial exploitation and attempted murder. The evidence presented during this trial demonstrates a pattern of predatory behavior spanning multiple years and multiple victims. Sarah sat 2 rows ahead of me, her posture straight and confident as she listened to the judge deliver justice for everything David had done to her and the other women he'd victimized. She testified beautifully during the trial, her voice clear and strong as she described the systematic theft, surveillance, and manipulation that had defined their marriage. The court finds that your crimes represent a serious threat to public safety and warrant the maximum sentence allowable under law, Judge Wells continued. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, you are sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison. On the charges of elder abuse and financial fraud, you are sentenced to an additional 15 years to be served consecutively. 40 years minimum before parole eligibility. David Richardson, now 36 years old, would be in his 70s before he could even apply for release. The mathematics of justice were deeply satisfying. Patricia Chin had testified via video link from Oregon, her calm recitation of David's previous crimes providing crucial evidence of his predatory pattern. 3 other women had also come forward during the trial, describing similar experiences with financial manipulation and theft. Each testimony had added weight to the prosecution's case, demonstrating that David's crimes against Sarah and me were part of a much larger criminal enterprise. Furthermore, Judge Wells said, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $437,000 to your victims, representing the full scope of financial damages caused by your criminal activities. The restitution amount was symbolic more than practical. David's assets had been seized and distributed to his victims months ago. But hearing the judge quantify the scope of his theft provided a kind of closure that money alone couldn't achieve. As court officers led David away in shackles, he turned briefly toward the gallery. His eyes found mine across the crowded courtroom, and for a moment, I saw a recognition of exactly how completely he'd misjudged his situation. The elderly woman he'd thought he could manipulate and abandon had orchestrated his total destruction with resources he'd never imagined existed. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that his ability to harm others had finally ended. David Richardson would spend the remainder of his productive years in prison. His victims would receive justice, and future potential targets would be protected from his predatory behavior. Outside the courthouse, Sarah was surrounded by reporters asking about her plans for the Patricia Chun Foundation and her advocacy work with other financial abuse survivors. I hung back, watching my daughter handle the attention with grace and purpose, transforming her painful experience into something that could help countless other women. Mrs. Long, a young woman, approached me carrying a notebook and wearing press credentials. I'm Jennifer Martinez from Channel 7 News. Could I ask you about your role in exposing Mr. Richardson's crimes? My role was protecting my daughter, I said simply. When someone threatens your family, you respond with whatever resources are necessary to ensure their safety. Sources say you conducted an extensive investigation into Mr. Richardson's background and financial activities. That seems like quite an undertaking for a private citizen. I smiled at her tactful way of asking how an elderly woman had managed to orchestrate such a comprehensive takedown of a serial predator. Young lady, never underestimate what a mother will do to protect her child. David Richardson made the mistake of assuming that quiet people are powerless. 3 months after David's sentencing, I stood in the conference room of the Patricia Chun Foundation's new headquarters, watching Sarah lead a meeting with attorneys, social workers, and law enforcement officials from across the region. The foundation had already helped 43 women escape financially abusive relationships, providing not just emergency funds, but comprehensive support for legal representation, job training, and long-term financial independence. "We're seeing patterns in how these predators operate," Sarah was explaining to the assembled group. "They target women who are trusting and generous, often recent widows or divorcees who are emotionally vulnerable. They use love and concern as weapons, gradually isolating their victims from support systems while systematically stealing their resources." The work was deeply personal for Sarah, but she'd found strength in transforming her trauma into advocacy. Her law school studies were progressing excellently, and she'd already been accepted into a prestigious internship with the district attorney's domestic violence unit. Rosa had become indispensable to the foundation's operations, her natural understanding of people and fierce protective instincts making her perfect for coordinating with abuse survivors. She'd also proven remarkably skilled at managing my business interests, allowing me to focus more attention on philanthropy and family. "There's something else," Sarah continued, addressing the meeting. "We're working with banking institutions to develop better training for recognizing financial abuse. Too often, bank employees see suspicious account activity but don't know how to intervene appropriately." Patricia Chun had relocated back to our city to work directly with the foundation, her experience and wisdom invaluable for helping new victims understand that their circumstances weren't their fault. She'd become something of a surrogate aunt to Sarah, their shared experience creating a bond that transcended their age difference. The foundation had also established a scholarship program for women pursuing education after leaving abusive relationships. Sarah had insisted on funding it generously, understanding from personal experience how educational opportunities could represent the difference between dependence and freedom. 6 months after David's conviction, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through my attorney. David had written from prison, apparently hoping to negotiate some kind of arrangement for early release or reduced restitution payments. The letter was pathetic in its transparent manipulation, filled with apologies that sounded rehearsed and promises of changed behavior that no one would believe. I read the letter once, then fed it directly into my paper shredder. David Richardson had forfeited any right to consideration or mercy when he'd planned to murder my daughter for insurance money. He could serve every day of his sentence while reflecting on the consequences of targeting the wrong family. A year after that night at the train station, Sarah graduated from law school with highest honors and accepted a position with the State Attorney General's office, specializing in financial crimes against elderly and vulnerable adults. Her work with the foundation had given her expertise that made her invaluable to prosecutors handling similar cases. The Patricia Chun Foundation had grown into a regional model for comprehensive support of financial abuse survivors, with requests from other cities to help establish similar programs. Sarah and Patricia traveled frequently to speak at conferences and train law enforcement agencies, their story becoming a powerful example of how victims could reclaim their power and help others. I had quietly increased my philanthropic activities, establishing additional foundations focused on elder abuse prevention, women's economic empowerment, and criminal justice reform. The wealth I'd spent decades accumulating in private was now being deployed strategically to address the kinds of systemic problems that created predators like David Richardson. Most importantly, Sarah had completely rebuilt her life on her own terms. She'd bought a beautiful house in a safe neighborhood, established financial independence that no one could threaten, and created meaningful work that transformed her painful experience into something that helped others. On the second anniversary of David's arrest, Sarah and I had dinner at the same cafe where I'd first revealed the truth about my wealth and David's crimes. The scared, financially dependent woman who'd sat across from me that day had been replaced by a confident attorney and advocate who radiated strength and purpose. "Mom, I've been thinking about something," Sarah said as we shared dessert. "All those years when I thought you were just getting by on Social Security and modest savings, you were actually building an empire. Why did you keep it secret for so long?" "Because wealth makes you a target, sweetheart. People see money and immediately start calculating how to separate you from it." I sipped my coffee thoughtfully. "But more than that, I wanted you to know you were loved for yourself, not for what you might inherit. I wanted you to develop your own strength and independence. And when David threatened me, when someone threatens my family, secrecy becomes secondary to protection." David Richardson thought he was manipulating a helpless elderly woman. Instead, he was threatening someone with the resources and determination to destroy him completely. I reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "You're my greatest achievement, Sarah. Everything else is just money." 3 years later, David Richardson remained in prison, his appeals exhausted and his parole eligibility still decades away. The women he'd victimized had all rebuilt their lives successfully, many of them now advocates helping other survivors. Patricia Chen had become a nationally recognized expert on financial abuse prevention, and the foundation bearing her name had helped hundreds of women escape dangerous relationships. I continued living in my modest apartment, taking public transportation and maintaining the quiet lifestyle that had served me well for decades. But now that lifestyle was a choice rather than a necessity, and the resources behind it were being used actively to protect other vulnerable people from predators like David. The train station where this story began had been renovated into a community center offering services for abuse survivors. Sarah had suggested the conversion, and I'd been happy to fund it. The empty platform where David had abandoned me, thinking I was powerless, now housed programs that gave real power to women escaping dangerous situations. Sometimes I walked through that community center in the evenings, watching support groups meet and educational programs unfold in spaces that had once been waiting areas for travelers. The transformation felt symbolic somehow. A place where someone had tried to demonstrate my vulnerability had become a source of strength for countless others. David Richardson had wanted to steal $50,000 from what he thought was my modest life savings. Instead, his crimes had unleashed hundreds of millions of dollars in resources dedicated to preventing future victims and supporting survivors. His greed had backfired so completely that it was almost poetic. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was watching Sarah thrive as the strong, independent woman she'd always been meant to be. David's manipulation had temporarily hidden her natural strength, but it had never actually diminished it. The moment she'd been given accurate information and adequate resources, she'd reclaimed her power completely. On quiet evenings in my apartment, I sometimes reflected on the lessons of those dramatic weeks. Wealth without purpose was just numbers and accounts, but wealth deployed strategically for protection and justice could reshape lives and prevent future tragedies. Privacy was valuable, but family was irreplaceable. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the best way to protect the people you love is to demonstrate exactly what happens when someone threatens them. David Richardson had gambled that an elderly woman living modestly would be an easy target for manipulation and theft. He'd lost that gamble so completely that he'd spend the rest of his productive years in prison, while his intended victims used his crimes as motivation to help countless others. The train had long since departed from that platform where the story began, but its destination had been justice, healing, and the kind of comprehensive victory that only comes when victims reclaim their power and use it to protect others. David Richardson was exactly where he belonged, and everyone he tried to harm was exactly where they deserved to be, free, strong, and making the world safer for the vulnerable. Sometimes the best revenge is simply ensuring that the people who tried to destroy you spend their lives watching you thrive while they face the consequences of their choices. David had wanted my money. Instead, He'd gotten a masterclass in why you should never underestimate quiet strength, maternal protection, and the strategic patience of someone who's spent decades building exactly the kind of power needed to destroy men like him completely.